Welcome to Defense Briefing. The content of the briefing includes China to expel prominent rocket scientist Wang Xiaojun from top body. Tuesday briefing. Biden faces treacherous political choices in answering deadly attack. Ukraine strikes on targets inside Russia hurt Putin's efforts to show the war isn't hitting home. Biden has to deal with a second war he didn't want. His task is to contain it. China to expel prominent rocket scientist Wang Xiaojun from top body. South China Morning Post. A prominent Chinese rocket scientist, Wang Xiaojun, is set to be expelled from China's top advisory body, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, CPPCC, following an investigation into leaders of the People's Liberation Army rocket force on suspicion of corruption. Wang, who led the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, will be removed as a representative on the CPPCC, although the decision is set to be made final in March. China has been targeting senior officials in and close to the rocket force, with several aerospace defense executives already being dismissed from the CPPCC in December. Tuesday briefing. New York Times. President Biden is facing a difficult decision on how to respond to a drone strike that killed 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan. The attack has been blamed on militant groups backed by Iran, and Biden has vowed to respond. However, any retaliation risks escalating the conflict and potentially starting a wider war. The attack on the U.S. soldiers is the first in which American troops have died, and U.S. officials believe a different level of response is warranted. Biden's options range from striking the Iran-backed militias directly, which would be a significant escalation, to targeting Iranian suppliers of drones and missiles, potentially opening up another front in the war. Iran has distanced itself from the attack, with a foreign ministry spokesperson stating that the militias do not take orders from Iran. Biden faces treacherous political choices in answering deadly attack. Washington Post. President Biden is considering how to respond to a drone attack that killed 3 U.S. service members. The U.S. believes Iran-backed militants were behind the strike, and Biden is keen to avoid being drawn into a wider conflict in the Middle East, especially as he faces a tough re-election campaign against a Republican opponent who is known for his tough stance on Iran. It is unclear how Biden plans to hold those responsible to account. U.S. officials have said that the soldiers were stationed in Jordan as part of a mission to counter ISIS, and their presence was unrelated to American support for Israel. The U.S. has been conducting military strikes against the Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen in response to their attacks on ships off the Arabian Peninsula. The Houthis say that they carried out the attacks in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. Republicans have criticized Biden for not responding more quickly to the drone strike, with some calling for strikes against Iran, though others have suggested targeting peripheral Iranian targets such as its oil export infrastructure or its navy. Democrats have urged caution while also criticizing Biden for not responding more quickly. Until the deaths of the U.S. service members, Democrats had been more critical of Biden's handling of the Israel-Gaza war than Republicans, who have praised Biden's support for Israel. The U.S. has been trying to stop the Israel-Gaza war from escalating further into a wider regional conflict. Ukraine's strikes on targets inside Russia hurt Putin's efforts to show the war isn't hitting home. Associated Press. Ukraine's increased capacity to strike back against Russia has resulted in a rise in attacks on Russian critical infrastructure. Recent attacks on Russian cities and military facilities have highlighted the war on Russian soil and challenged President Vladimir Putin's attempts to maintain an air of normalcy ahead of the presidential election in March. These attacks have also caused fear and panic among Russian citizens, particularly in border cities like Belgorod. The attacks have resulted in casualties and damage to infrastructure, prompting residents to evacuate and seek safety. The conflict is also challenging the Kremlin's control of the political scene, with signs of dissent and opposition emerging within Russia. The Ukrainian attacks have exposed Russia's vulnerability and raised concerns about the country's ability to defend its critical infrastructure. The attacks on oil refineries, in particular, have the potential to cause serious consequences if they continue. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine shows no signs of abating and is escalating with each attack. Biden has to deal with a second war he didn't want. His task is to contain it. CNN. The United States is once again mired in a war in the greater Middle East, less than 3 years after President Joe Biden officially declared the end of a 2-decade-long combat mission in Iraq. The Biden administration's efforts to prevent escalation appear to be failing, with U.S. strikes against Iranian-backed militias throughout the region not deterring a recent drone attack in Jordan. Meanwhile, missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea continue, despite U.S. airstrikes against their launch sites in Yemen. Biden now faces the challenge of preventing the region-wide war from spiraling out of control. Many experts fear the situation will deteriorate further before it improves. Biden's options are limited and unpalatable. Hawkish Republicans are calling for the U.S. to launch strikes against Iran on Iranian soil, while some progressives are expressing dismay at the president's refusal to demand a ceasefire in Gaza. The Biden administration plans to respond to the recent deaths of 3 Americans in Jordan with a more powerful, sustained response than previous U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria against Iranian interests. However, officials have suggested that the U.S. is unlikely to strike within Iran. Biden must consider how Iran will respond not just immediately, but in the months to come. The U.S. response is likely to involve punishing attacks against the capabilities of Iran's proxies in the region. The U.S. is leading a coalition of nations to protect trade routes in the Red Sea, but this has not stopped attacks on commercial shipping. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has been waging a low-level war against Israel, and the U.S. has carried out attacks on Iran-backed groups in Iraq, damaging relations with the Baghdad government. Israel has expanded its own war by killing a senior Hamas leader in Beirut, and Iran has blamed Israel for an attack that killed a number of Revolutionary Guard officers in Damascus. The conflict has yet to acquire a destructive momentum, and Iran appears to be avoiding a full-scale regional war. However, the situation is incredibly volatile, and the conflict could spiral further out of control. South Korea detects another cruise missile launch by North. Deutsche Welle. North Korea has fired multiple unidentified cruise missiles into the sea off its west coast, according to South Korea. This is the third such test in less than a week. South Korean and U.S. intelligence agencies are currently conducting a detailed analysis of the missiles. North Korea has intensified its cruise missile testing this year, and tensions in the region have risen as a result. The United States, South Korea, and Japan have been expanding their combined military exercises in response. No political interference over missing Iraq War cabinet documents. ABC. A review of cabinet records from 2003 in Australia has found no evidence of political interference after some documents related to the Iraq War were kept secret. The review, conducted by former senior public servant Dennis Richardson, revealed an administrative error and internal systemic issues as the cause for the documents not being transferred to the National Archives of Australia. 4 additional records were also found to have not been transferred. The review ruled out political interference and made recommendations for improving archiving processes, which the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has already begun implementing. Defense Department identifies 3 soldiers killed at base in Jordan. New York Times. 3 Army Reserve soldiers have been killed and 34 others wounded in a drone attack at a U.S. base in Jordan. The Biden administration has said that the drone attack was carried out by an Iran-backed militia. The soldiers were assigned to the 718th Engineer Company, which is trained to deploy at short notice to build roads, landing fields, and protective earthen berms for U.S. forces. The soldiers were stationed at a remote desert logistics outpost in Jordan near the borders of Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. The U.S. has long used Jordan as a launch point for operations in the region. The new World War II Air Force drama from Spielberg and Hanks hits turbulence. The Sydney Morning Herald. Masters of the Air, a new Apple TV Plus series produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, is a visually stunning show that lacks emotional depth, according to a review in The Guardian. The series tells the story of master aviators during World War II and is intended to complement Spielberg and Hanks' previous war-themed projects, Band of Brothers and the Pacific. However, the reviewer found that Masters of the Air lacked the grit and contemporary edge of those earlier series. The show's attention to detail was praised, but it was suggested that it may be a weakness, as the production lacks grittiness and feels more like an archival image brought to life. Retribution in the Israel-Hamas War. Foreign policy. This article argues that rape has historically been used as a weapon of war to mobilize support and incite violence. The author points to the use of rape in the conflicts between the United States and Japan during World War II and between Israel and Hamas in the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict as examples. In both cases, the author claims that instances of rape were used to justify and escalate violence against the enemy. The author also argues that the media plays a role in perpetuating this cycle of violence by sensationalizing and propagandizing instances of rape. The author concludes by calling for a more nuanced and balanced approach to reporting on conflicts, including giving all parties involved an opportunity to explain their actions. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Dr. Six, your resident observer from the 6 dimensions. Today, we have quite a range of news stories to discuss, so let's dive right in. First, we have news from China, where prominent rocket scientist Wang Xiaojun is set to be expelled from China's top advisory body due to an investigation into corruption. It seems China is cracking down on senior officials in and close to the rocket force, as several aerospace defense executives were already dismissed in December. Looks like they're cleaning house. Next, we turn our attention to President Biden, who is facing a difficult decision on how to respond to a drone strike that killed 3 U.S. soldiers in Jordan. The attack has been blamed on Iran-backed militant groups, and Biden has vowed to respond. However, any retaliation risks escalating the conflict and potentially starting a wider war. Biden, my friend, you've got quite the challenge ahead. Speaking of Biden, he's also facing treacherous political choices in answering this deadly attack. With a tough re-election campaign on the horizon and a Republican opponent known for his tough stance on Iran, Biden must tread carefully. The U.S. officials believe a different level of response is warranted, but how will Biden hold those responsible to account? It's a delicate balancing act for sure. Moving on, let's talk about Ukraine, where their strikes on targets inside Russia are hurting Putin's efforts to maintain a sense of normalcy. These attacks have caused fear and panic among Russian citizens and have challenged the Kremlin's control of the political scene. It seems Ukraine's increased capacity to strike back is exposing Russia's vulnerability. The conflict is escalating, and it's anyone's guess how it will unfold. Now, let's circle back to Biden once again. It seems he's dealing with a second war he didn't want, just 3 years after declaring the end of a combat mission in Iraq. The situation in the Middle East is deteriorating, and Biden's efforts to prevent escalation are failing. Hawkish Republicans are calling for strikes against Iran, while progressives are expressing dismay at the president's refusal to demand a ceasefire in Gaza. Biden's options are limited and unpalatable. It's a tough spot to be in, my friends. In other news, North Korea is at it again, firing multiple unidentified cruise missiles into the sea off its west coast. This is the third test in less than a week. Tensions in the region are rising, and the United States, South Korea, and Japan are expanding their military exercises in response. Let's hope things don't escalate further. Moving on, we have news from Australia, where a review of cabinet records related to the Iraq War has found no evidence of political interference. It turns out there was an administrative error and internal systemic issues to blame for the documents not being transferred to the National Archives. No conspiracy theories here, folks. Tragically, we must also acknowledge the loss of 3 Army Reserve soldiers in a drone attack at a U.S. base in Jordan. The Biden administration has attributed the attack to an Iran-backed militia. These soldiers were stationed at a remote desert outpost and were part of a company trained to deploy at short notice for various construction tasks. Our thoughts go out to their families and fellow soldiers. On a lighter note, let's talk entertainment. Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks have teamed up once again for a new Apple TV Plus series called Masters of the Air. Unfortunately, the series seems to be hitting some turbulence. While visually stunning, it is said to lack emotional depth and the contemporary edge of their previous war-themed projects. Not every flight can be smooth, my friends. Lastly, we have an intriguing article discussing the use of rape as a weapon of war. The author argues that instances of rape have been used historically to mobilize support and incite violence. They point to examples from World War II and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The author calls for a more nuanced and balanced approach to reporting on conflicts, giving all parties involved an opportunity to explain their actions. And there you have it, my friends. A whirlwind of news from around the world. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on these stories? Do you have any burning questions? Let's open the floor for discussion. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.